There's history here.
And here.
There's history there.
History is everywhere.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm really excited about this project. This has been a long time coming. I've spent so many years being driven by all this research that I've done on this family. And I've traveled to New York, the New York Archive, the New York State Archives, to Washington, D.C. several times. I have kids that live there, so that makes it easy for me. And I've done research in the Oregon Historical Society and U of O, and of course right here in Talent. And with the, our library isn't here anymore. I keep pointing to our Beeson diaries, and they're back there now. And of course the Beeson diaries. The other part about this project that I've struggled with, like wrestling with an angel, is that I really have a lot of loyalty toward Wellborn Beeson, and I was really leaning toward doing some serious book about him because I wanted to give him some credit. You know, John Beeson, his father, got all the glory and all the ridicule and all the notoriety out of his work as an advocate for the Native Americans. And Wellborn stayed back on the farm and helped fund his father's mission while his father was away for so long. Wellborn wrote an amazing diary that I don't think, in my humble opinion, I don't think there is another diary quite so detailed, quite so fascinating, quite so personal as the Wellborn Beeson diary. Many diaries that I've transcribed in this area and other places have been weather reports, trip diaries where someone's taking a trip to Yellowstone or someplace and they're talking about it, and they just don't have the depth and the continuity of the day-to-day life that I'm interested in. I'm fascinated by his relationships that he forms with his father and his mother and his wife when he gets married, and many of you followed the Facebook page during that tumultuous time when his mother died, and he asked his wife Kate to marry him on the day that his mother died, and got married shortly thereafter. Very revealing of the inner person. So I was into Wellborn, and but John kept tugging at me. I kept hearing little messages from John, and I kept stumbling upon these incredible, weird things that John did. And he just became a much more complicated person than I imagined him to be. And of course, there's so much more information about John that's not personal, that's secondhand kind of accounts of his lectures and how much he charges people to come and see his song and dance with LaRuca. Come on in, Bob. There's places in the front. Yep. And so, you know, Wellborn's primary source, John's mostly secondary sources. I'm almost positive that John kept a diary as well, but that has not been found. I don't think the family kept it, and what a tragedy that is. But I know from his book, his plea for the Indians, this book that he wrote in 1857 while he was in New York, that he had some kind of reference to draw from when he wrote this book, because he gives dates and names of people, and sometimes he gets the names wrong, but he does have some kind of form of reference, and I'm pretty sure he had a diary as well. Too bad, it's gone. The dynamics of the family are interesting as well. The Wellborn Beeson diaries, which the Talent Historical Society got, I think it's about 2006, we got a grant to microfilm all of the Wellborn Beeson diaries. They had been kind of tucked away at the University of Oregon. You could see them. There were some years when you couldn't see them because they hadn't accessioned them and processed them yet. And so some historians like Stephen Dow Beckham said, well, they're not available, can't find them. They're at the U of O, but nobody can see them. Well, I started, before I ever even knew that there was a Talent Historical Society, I started to go up to Eugene and I would read Wellborn Beeson's diaries. And I would hand copy, because I didn't have the money to pay for photocopies, and some of them they wouldn't let you photocopy because they're too fragile. And I would write down these fascinating things that Wellborn Beeson would say. And I got very involved with that story of the family. Now, to me, this writing a book about someone so complicated and so bizarre in many ways, he had a different worldview than most of the people that he associated with. And they could tell he was different. And they didn't know quite how to react to him, and so many times his message was plain and clear, but he was rejected because the messenger was kind of weird. And so I'm going to respectfully approach him, though, because I do have a lot of respect for his courage. And just one example of his courage I'll tell you right now. In 1855, John had been here for a couple of years, been in Oregon, lived on Wagner Creek. He happened to be on jury duty in Jacksonville at the old courthouse, not the brick one. And he heard a group of men gathering outside somewhere in Jacksonville. I don't know if it was by the courthouse or if it was down in some saloon somewhere. But he heard a group of men recruiting to go and massacre a bunch of Indians. And this was openly the goal. They were going to kill these Indians. They were planning it for a couple of days, and they were recruiting in Jacksonville on the day that John was doing jury duty. He heard them, and if it was me, I might have gone home and written about it in my diary, but I would have run as far as I could away from that group of men. And John didn't. He approached the group and started to reason with them, started to say, hey, wait a minute, isn't that against the law to kill people? And don't we live in America? And isn't everybody equal here? And aren't we supposed to give them a chance? And the crowd, of course, did not appreciate that. And that weekend was a quarterly meeting for all the churches in the area. John went to the meeting on Sunday. And again, he heard the preachers standing up and condoning this behavior, condoning this planned massacre that was going to happen. And when the preacher stopped preaching and people started coming forward to give their testimonies or whatever they were doing, the preacher called for one other person to come up. Who came up? John Beeson. And again, he pled with them, and he said, even I couldn't even appeal to their selfishness. They were so unreasonable. And he said that their selfishness would have been to protect themselves and not stir up a bunch of trouble, because for sure the Indians were going to come after them and retaliate. And who would they retaliate against? Women and children and families. And so he was trying to protect both the Indians from being slaughtered and the white people. He said, just don't go. Don't do it. That evening, the men camped out by Little Butte Creek, and early in the morning, they slaughtered at least 28. And there were, most of them were women and children and old men, not a warrior, not a man in the group. And the historians of the day, the next day, the Indians went on their own rampage to retaliate, and they burned a bunch of houses and they killed some white people, and they kept going up by Evans Creek and Merlin and that area. And that's when the white people were just outraged. My God, how can they do this to us? Look at those savage people. They had this planned all along. They could not possibly, the whites said, be prepared the very next day to slaughter us. They're not that organized. And John Beeson said he knew about it 4 days before it happened. Of course the Indians knew it was going to happen. That's why the men weren't at the Indian camp, because they were out preparing for war. They knew what was going to happen. John Beeson, that moment, John Beeson says, radicalized him, made him alive with desire. That's the wording that he used. It turned his soul upside down. It made him want to cry for these people and for the foolishness of the white people who were really hurting themselves as much as they were hurting the Indians. John, after that, started writing newspaper article after newspaper article, sending them out, not getting them published. The newspapers didn't like him. They were in that day, does this sound familiar to you? In that day and age, the newspapers were very biased. I had this plan in my mind to ask you to make a little noise every time something sounded familiar, like today, like snap or go, oh, or something, because, you can tell that this story is the never-ending story. It's the story of humanity. It's our messes that we make over and over again, and we wonder, how do we get ourselves here? And John Beeson was this kind of voice of reason that was too far removed from the reality of people's lives. When you get mad, when a man gets mad or his family is in danger, he's going to do something. That's just the way we are. We're wired that way. But John Beeson expected people, he had a higher standard, and he really wanted people to live the golden rule. That was his answer to everything. He preached the golden rule. He was not a religious man. He had grown up a Methodist when he was living in England, where he was born. And, but even the preachers of the day recognized and wrote in their diaries about the Beeson family, oh, they used to be a praying family, but now they're only moral. So they were not considered a religious family. They were considered free thinkers. And later on, John Beeson and the whole Talent neighborhood got involved with a universal mental liberty hall that they built on the Beeson property, and had, you know, lectures and debates and dances, and preachers come and talk, and they really prided themselves in not being conventional. This is a quote, I'm quoting myself here. Tom thinks it's his quote, but it's mine. Talent was Ashland before Ashland was Ashland. And there was a lot of New Age stuff going on. There was a lot of spiritualism. There was a lot of free thinking and just non-conventional and non-traditional stuff going on up and down Wagner Creek, which is why Talent is so cool. I love Talent. Anyway, I need to write this book, and I feel, woo, this is hard. I feel so compelled to tell his story. I feel the same as he felt. To tell their story, to tell the Indian side of the story. And I feel that he is making a comeback here. You know, John Beeson's coming back. And he's coming back in a good way. I think we need him. I think there's things in this world that we're struggling with right now that are really, it's like I said before, it's just who we are. We're wired this way, we're human beings. We have, you know, we make a mess and then we get up and then we make another mess and then we, you know, we do things like that. But I think this mess has a parallel to the times that he lived in. And he lived in rough times. I in no way believe that we have it harder than in that day and age. I believe that it was just as hard for them, and the issues of the day were so much more, it was harder to get information. We have instantaneous information. Everybody's videotaping your worst moments, you know. And if only John Beeson had had a video camera. I mean, you know, that would have solved the problem right there. But he didn't have that. And it took months to get a letter from Oregon to New York and back again. And even when the Pony Express was operating here in Talent, it took days to get news. And then the telegraph brought the news quicker, but it was all these little diddy things. It wasn't, you know, the whole voluminous thing that you want to get. So I think one of the reasons that I want to talk about him in the book is that I believe he had a method to his madness. I think he had a formula that he used over and over again that we can learn from. It's not modern, and it's not politically correct at times, but it was to the point, and he stayed on one point throughout the Civil War, after the Civil War, you know, until he died. He harped away day after day, time after time, letter after letter was about the same subject. How can we make the Indians happy? How can we bring about their growth and their progress and their spirituality? And how can we copy them? How? He saw in them not the savage that most people saw. He saw a spirituality, a way to heal. He was very interested in medicine. He called himself a physician. On the census, he's listed as a physician because he took some water cure classes. And when he had to leave this valley and was driven out of this valley for his stance on the Indian Wars, he sailed to New York. And he had, I think it was something like $20 or something by the time he got there, which is a lot of money, in my opinion, back in that day. I had $28 with me when I came home from the Peace Corps. That was all I had in the world. So he lived in New York at the Water Cure Institute. That's where he felt at home. He was welcomed there. He could take classes there. He could do his hydrotherapy and the things that he loved to do and mix with other people of the same genre as he was, which was important to John Beeson. He did come home in 1865, and I think it must have been hell for him to be in talent. Well, it wasn't talent then, it was still Wagner Creek. It was after the Civil War. He had spoken to President Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. He had spoken with Thaddeus Stevens. He had spoken with senators and congressmen and rich philanthropists all over the East Coast. I don't think talent's that stimulating, and nobody wanted to listen to him here. Oregonians did not regard him. Ben, the other day, sent me an article that was written in 1934. People were still talking about him in 1934, still bitter about that John Beeson messing with them, you know. And, this little article written at the Statesman Journal in Oregon just kind of like debunks Beeson and just says, you know, he lampooned the Democratic Party and was censorious toward Governor Curry and his advisors and exceedingly unjust to the people of Southern Oregon. In short, he made himself hated by practically all the whites. And it was sort of true. Wellborn would write in his journal when John diligently walked to Jacksonville to give a lecture, and then he'd walk home and tell Beeson and tell his son Wellborn that nobody came, that people didn't regard him at all, and they didn't want to listen to him. And Wellborn would write in his diary and say, oh, those darn Jacksonville people, they're so mean, you know, and they're so disrespectful of my father, and he's harmless, he's not going to hurt anybody, and why don't they just, you know, respect their elders. And he created this whole, he was an individual, and that's another piece that I think I take kind of an example from, is he was only one individual. He did not generally, he did join associations and groups when it was beneficial to him. And then he'd become, you know, like the chairman or the secretary or something like, you know, Talent Historical Society or something. But he did not he did not get government sanction. You know, he asked all the time, will you give me money so I can go visit the Indians in Oklahoma, or will you, make me an Indian agent? Will you allow me to go and visit the Indian tribes? Will you, he applied to the government over and over and over. The Indian Bureau is full of letters from John Beeson and other people. And they would say, no, you're too old, or no, I appreciate what you do, but we really don't need you, and we don't have enough money to send you. And he'd ask again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. And he always kind of felt a little bit like that was missing, that he didn't have the authority to go in there. And he even wanted to be appointed like a superintendent of Indian Affairs in Oregon, so that he could walk back to Oregon and show them, because Oregon had kicked him out, and Oregon had written nasty things about him in their papers and discredited him over and over again. When the senators or the congressmen would come from Oregon to Washington, D.C., John would go to D.C. and haggle him and talk to him and tell him, you did everything wrong, and nobody wants to hear that, nobody wants to hear that. But John had the information to back it up. He had reports from the government. He read all of the reports. He was like my son Luke, that reads all these Forest Service things and BLM things, and I'm like, whoa, boring. But he read all of those reports and all of the technical things to arm himself with as much knowledge as he could in that day and age. And he kept saying, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about this? Just like some of the groups that we belong to today. We keep harping at different things. Same kind of continuous grading action, hoping that it will have an effect. And the commissioners to the Indian Bureau came and went. John Beeson remained. Some of them got fired, some of them got let go because they were caught being, pocketing the money that was supposed to go to the Indians. He knew all about that, and he kept harping on it. My feeling is one of the biggest accomplishments, professional accomplishments of John Beeson, is that he delayed the pensions. Now, this was a really good trick. I think this is probably happening today in some ways too. So the white miners and the people who labeled themselves exterminators of the Indians, the ones who were warring with the Indians, created the war for plunder, for money, so that they could apply to the government and say, oh my gosh, the Indians burned my house down, and it was worth $50,000. And they charge him $780 for a mule that only was worth $10, and they'd pump up these prices and apply to the government. It was big business. War was business. Hey, that sounds familiar. And they created it, and John Beeson saw right through that, and he knew that. And he said that. He was an individual willing to speak up. He had a mantra of his that said, the power to do good comes with the responsibility of doing it. Wow. So you better not know anything. You're better to be a bliss ninny than have that kind of power, because once you know, you have to do something. You can't sit. And he would get so frustrated with his neighbors because before he left Oregon, he talked to many people. He would get all frustrated and excited about, what was happening. And he was an eyewitness. He was here. A lot of times the things that we get excited about are in Thailand, or, there's an earthquake in Haiti, or there's a Katrina happens, and, it just fills us with, I got to do something. I want to do something. You know what I did when Katrina hit? I bought packages of underwear for people. I don't know why. That's what I thought they needed the most. That's what I would want, underwear. But John Beeson had a little bit better plan than I did. And then, once I've done something, I think, oh, good, I did something. And then I quit. And then it's on to the next disaster, and you feel bad, and, the little Syrian child shows his bloody face on the TV, and we're just like, what can I do? Well, when you see something, you're actually in the area, you're locally involved, and you see something happening, and you don't do something, then you lost your power, because the power to do good comes with the responsibility of doing it. That's what I get from John Beeson, anyway. Boy, I'm a preacher, aren't I? I did bring, where is that? We only have 4 pictures that I know of John Beeson. This is one of them, and I believe that this one was probably taken in back east, when he was back east. Wellborn Beeson wrote in his diary that he received a picture of his father, and he said, he just looks spry and young, just like he always did. The other picture is actually a drawing, and this picture came from the Calumet. Now, this is another action thing that John Beeson did. In addition to writing a plea for the Indians and telling his story about his expulsion from Oregon and what he saw as the causes of the Indian Wars, he started a newsletter. And it was a grand undertaking. It was going to be published in Boston, New York, where else? I can't remember. But he was going to have agents in these different cities. And then he started to write. And what he was going to do was feature a different Indian and talk about this Indian and say what good things Indians were doing. Now that sounds familiar too, like Women's History Month, Black Heritage Days, all that stuff. We do that now as historians and as Americans. We try to be inclusive, and we try to bring their stories into the picture. Well, that's what John Beeson was doing with the Calumet. The Calumet means peace pipe, and so he was going to pass around the peace pipe to all these cities, and he made 10,000 copies of this, and then went broke. But this drawing was in the Calumet. He had some artist, and that's one of the things. Mary, you made it. Thank you. Hi, Becky. That was one of the things that one of my research goals is to find out who drew this picture. I would really like to find that out. I suppose it's kind of a wood block, kind of a etching thing, but there's no signature on it. So I'm gonna find that out. Anyway, that's the second picture. The third picture is, where is that one? When I used to work at Southern Oregon Historical Society, I was going through an album one day, and holy moly, I saw picture of John Beeson in somebody else's photo album. Come in, Mary. There's this. I saved you and Becky a spot right up here. somebody had put these pictures in an album and saved them. And I don't even know if it was a Beeson family album or what it was, but it had a picture of John Beeson. And then this other one, this is the only other picture that I know of him. This is the fourth one. And this one is him sitting in front. He looks like the honorary guest at a school program on Wagner Creek. These are probably some of his grandkids, and this is Rosa Waters playing the organ. She was the school teacher at the Wagner Creek School. I've heard, I don't tell anybody because I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that there are some daguerreotypes and maybe some tintypes and ambrotypes of John Beeson's family back in Michigan. Some of his descendants have that. They're denying it at the moment, but I have a letter that says that they do have it. So I'm very carefully trying to massage those away from them. The other sources that I have a page on my computer here. Nobody knocked this over because my project's dead if you kill it. Tom said this was in a bad spot. Anyway, my computer is full. There's 135 pages of just a list of all of the newspaper articles, diary mentions, letters, lectures that he gave, all those kinds of things by year. And so these are some of the things that I'm going to draw from to write this book. Here's a letter that he wrote from Philadelphia, and there's all kinds of libraries that have information about John Beeson. The Huntington Library has a whole collection of John Beeson, John Brophy papers. So I'm not starving for information anymore. And my friend Shannon Applegate said to me once, you know when you have to start writing, when you bump up against the same sources over and over again. So stop researching, start writing. So that's what I'm trying to do with this Kickstarter project. And just on a personal note, the reason that I need to do a Kickstarter project is not only, well, I'm broke, but I have this really great opportunity right now. I'm in between jobs. I'm not, when I was working, I'd come home and I just kind of veg out. I still kept researching. I still kept searching for things about John Beeson, and I'd go on my research trips and I'd talk to my sister and I'd do all these things to stay involved, but I just couldn't write after I got home. So now I have the time, and I really think that talent needs to also have a comeback, and talent needs to be put on the map. And again, of course it's on the map already, right? But I think it would kind of rejuvenate a sense of place for people who want to know what's so weird about this town, what's so different about this town, why does it have this difference? We're different than Phoenix, right? Yeah. We're different than Jacksonville. You know, we have our own personality, and I want to keep that personality with you guys as a community, so that we know our past and we know how to go forward with who we are, with that strength. I had a really good friend. I was doing an oral history project with him and writing the story of his life, and he said over and over again, I am the product of so many generations. He was a doctor and real accomplished man, had lived in Pakistan for many, many years, and done all these wonderful, crazy things. And he didn't consider himself to be, you know, like the end all and be all of the family. He thought it was still going to keep going. It was still going to keep progressing because he was building. He was building. He wasn't trying to make it happen just to praise himself. And that's the way I think Wellborn felt. When you have a famous father or an infamous father, whichever way you want to look at it, it's hard to build. It's hard to overcome that. It's hard to establish a name for yourself and distinguish yourself. Everyone thinks, oh, you're that John Beeson kid. You know, you're his son. Well, Wellborn was his own person and his own right and in his own way. He hid things from his father. He hid his gambling and his tobacco chewing from his father because he knew his father would not approve. And he told his wife, don't tell my father I do those things. Because he wanted to be good in his father's eyes. In the end, Beeson was John Beeson. As I said, he came back in 1865. And he was here when his wife died, but he was sort of not here when his wife died. He was out plowing corn while she sat in the house with Wellborn and Wellborn only. And Wellborn sat with her to her last breath, and the father didn't even come in till after supper. So Wellborn didn't say anything about that. He just recorded that fact in his diary. So we can draw whatever conclusion we want from that, but that doesn't sound like a close relationship to me. One of the reasons, I think, could be, while John was in the East, one of the most fun things that I found out that he did was he traveled with a woman named Laruqua, an Indian maiden who sang like Jenny Lind and performed all over the East Coast. John would take her as a little sideshow. She would sing Minnehaha and all these songs about how she had been, you know, she was an Indian, she was a Penobscot Indian, and she sang very emotionally tinged songs to get that audience, you know, to get them. Just like circle around them and draw them in, and then John Beeson would get up and make them cry again, you know. And she traveled with him for a couple of years. She sang before President Lincoln. Then things fell apart. John, one of the letters that I found in Washington, D.C. said that John was appealing to the Indian Bureau to please take Laruqua off of his hands, that he couldn't afford to keep her any longer, and that she needed a place to go, and she was destitute, and he was destitute, and he just couldn't do it anymore. She had a couple of kids that were with her. So the government ended up allowing Laruqua, not John, and the government actually said to him, well, she's corrupt because you corrupted her. And the sooner she can get away from you, the better. So we're going to find a nice Negro family for her to live with in Philadelphia. And so as far as I know, that's what happened to Laruqua. And can you imagine coming home from New York and DC and all these places back east, and then coming home and telling your wife all about Laruqua and all about the stories, all about the adventures you'd had. Wellborn says in his diary he got sick of hearing his father talk about all that stuff. And as though he was better than anyone else. And really, John just needed more stimulation, is what he was trying to say. I need some help here. I need to breathe. And so another thing that Wellborn said in his diary was that he went for a long walk because he couldn't stand the way his father and mother interacted with each other. It made him so sad because he had waited 8 years and 8 months and 1 day for his father to return. And then when he did, the parents were fighting. Of course they were. I mean, they're human. I would too. But anyway, so the story is multifaceted. It involves other reforms, not just Indian reforms. It's about having a good diet. John Beeson was into that. He knew Graham, the graham cracker guy. He knew all kinds of vegetarians and people that were experimenting with different kinds of diets and foods in universal languages and universal peace organizations. And he would go to any number of conventions. He even went to a free love convention. It was called a free love convention after the convention was over because some woman got up and said, marriage is a sham. Marriage enslaves women, and you shouldn't do it, women. And boy, the papers had a heyday with that, and they called it the Free Love Convention after that. John Beeson did speak at that convention, but to my disappointment, he spoke about Indians instead of about free love. So, I don't want to tell you everything, because then you won't read the book. So, unless you have questions. Yes?
You mentioned that you would schedule a talk in Jacksonville and nobody would show up. I would think there would be at least some people who were sympathetic to his views. Did he find any sense of community here that you're aware of?
He did amongst spiritualists. There were a few neighbors here, John Holton, and some other neighbors who were avid spiritualists having seances every night, calling on, other dead Indians and that sort of thing. Maybe that's where Dead Indian Memorial Road comes from. I don't know. But not, no, he did not have the respect of the community, really.
So there was no group in this area that was actually advocating for Indian rights
No.
at that time? Nothing like that?
No. That's why I said, it was important to know that he was kind of an individual. There were groups that were trying to affect reform in other places that were groups, but not here. Oregon was bent on that they were right and that, justifying what they did with the Indians here. Yeah.
Well, in Southern Oregon, there just weren't that many people here, were there?
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of people.
Yeah, that's true. There's not a lot of people, but that's true. Yeah.
What do you know about the adverse consequences his son had to live through by virtue of the ruling? This guy being progressive in a time that was not ready for it.
That's a really good question. It's really interesting. I have thought a lot about that. And I find, okay, so when John Beeson left, he left because there was an indignation meeting called. And that's not a word we use a lot anymore. I kind of like the word, indignation. It sounds cool. But it's, the people who formed that indignation meeting, who called that meeting, Wellborn lived here. He had to keep interacting with those people. They became the state legislatures and the judge and the all the official government officials, and he had to interact with them. So he stayed and interacted with John Beeson's enemies, basically, and doesn't show a hint of malice or retaliation or anything like that in his diaries. He knows to get along with people. To live here, you have to compromise. You have to get along. You can't hold a grudge, and you can't ostracize them from your life, because there is no other postmaster. There is no other, storekeeper. There's only a couple, and you've got to deal with them. So Wellborn kind of felt, according to his diaries, felt used. His father kept asking him for money. His father kept writing and saying, well, I stayed at John Joyce's house for 5 months and I still owe him for room and board, and so, sell another cow, cut off some acreage, do something. And when Wellborn would complain, this was interesting too, John Beeson would say something like, son, I feel for you. But think about those Indians. Think about what they've lost. And it just can't compare. And I'm working for them. And I have to. And their case is worse than yours. And you're going to be okay. So that kind of lack of attention and lack of pampering kind of got to him. And Wellborn says it ruined his health. Wellborn was 19 years old when his father left. His father was 52. Wellborn was the only child in the family. Other families had like 8 kids. And so they could spread the work, the chores and the cows and the, building fences and doing all that stuff around to the family and make the kids, slave labor. And Wellborn had no one else. He had to take care of his mother. And she wasn't going to go out there and plow the fields and do all that stuff. So Wellborn had the entire responsibility of a 360-acre farm. And what he did, which was kind of interesting, in those days, the donation land claims were usually divided in half. The woman usually got the south half, and the man got the north half, which is the case in the Beeson family. So the home was on the south half. The garden, the vegetable garden, was on the south half. Wellborn focused on the south half. Let the north half go fallow. Because that's the part that was supposed to earn the money for John Beeson. So it was kind of a subtle little, yeah.
What led this progressive man to Southern Oregon in the first place? And how did he end up in town?
Very good question. Love that question. John Beeson was from England. When he was 10 years old, he was apprenticed out to a confectioner. He learned to be a baker. He dealt with dough and sugar and all that kind of stuff. He made little pastries from the time he was 10 years old until he left England. He didn't really like being a confectioner. And so when he immigrated to America, and isn't it cool that he's an immigrant? He's an immigrant telling Americans how to be Americans and stick to the Constitution and stick to the rules. Anyway, he says in his, I think it's in the Plea for the Indians, that he felt ashamed of himself for introducing sugar and refined flour to people. That he was only feeding their indulgence and their gluttony And he didn't like that. So he decided he would be a farmer. And how people knew how to be a farmer, I don't know. But he moved to Illinois in 1834. And
how old was he when he immigrated?
he was, let's see, he immigrated in 1830. He was born in 1803. So please, somebody do the math, guys. Good. Hey, you guys are smart. Anyway, so he immigrated to Illinois and started a farm there in Vermilionville, Illinois, in LaSalle County. And he was there for quite a number of years. He participated in the Underground Railroad. He was a radical abolitionist. He was more zealous than even the other abolitionists next door. You know, he just somehow had that gene that just was extreme. Whatever he was doing, he just went full bore. In the Wellborn Beeson diary that has the 1853 Crossing the Plains diary, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but that has been published for a long time. Wellborn describes how his father said, "Get in the wagon," you know, this wagon with a black cover over it. He said, "Drive that wagon home." Wellborn's, okay, drives the wagon home, and a slave gets out of the back. The black wagon was meant to be like you had a disease, somebody diseased in your wagon, so nobody would bother you. They would avoid you. And John, you know, set him up for that. And he could have got, you know, arrested or whatever, the kid, for doing that. And then the slave state, his name was William Gray. He even named him. What a dummy. And he stayed overnight in the Beeson house, and then they carried him off to the next station. So, and that was just one example of their being in the Underground Railroad. He was also involved in this party that nobody's ever heard of anymore. It's called the Liberty Party. And it was so radical that it even questioned the Constitution because it allowed for slavery. And they put up a candidate in 1844, I think, and John Beeson's name is in the paper in LaSalle County, or on the committee, you know, voting for the Liberty Party. There was no Republican Party at that time. It was the Whigs and the Democrats, and he was not a Whig, he was not a Democrat. He was a Liberty Party, backing the guy who was the most radical because of the slavery issue. So he says his answer to that question is that he got restless. He just wanted to go somewhere. And he heard about Oregon, and he went. He convinced his family that was the thing to do. And they, you know, loaded the wagons, sold their farm, and I've been to that farm, I've been to that property, and it's still in the same family that the Beesons sold it to in 1853. The same family still owns that piece of land. And so his restlessness drove him, just like everyone else, you know, everybody's going crazy and wants gold and farms and all that kind of stuff. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, he took Indian land, he settled out here and he took Indian land. Well, he kind of skirted around that by saying, I bought it from somebody else who took it from the Indians. So, which he did. So it was already there when he got here. In 1853, he came into Fort Wagner, was here at the time that he got here, and a little fortification over here by where the trailer park is now on Talent Avenue, and right across the street from where I live. So I think they camped on my front yard. I do. Anyway, that's the best I can do on that. Anybody else have a question?
question, but when I read the diary of Wellborn, I hear criticism about his father. I sense when his, well, the mother died, that at that time was very clear. But there are other times when there's work that needs to be done or the money that his dad asked for. I find I would be probably worse than that, but I mean, I do find him being critical.
Yeah, you should read my diaries. I'm so mean to my dad. Yeah, so bad. Yeah.
Did I hear you say that he didn't marry until his mother died? What were all the dynamics there?
Oh, that's a whole another story. I do a program called Jackson County Love Story, and I talk about that. Men didn't get married young. The women did, or the girls did, as a general rule. This is a picture of Wellborn and Kate, his wife. This is, I think, October 6, 1866. They went to the Brit studio and sat for their portrait. They had been married a few days, so it was not their wedding picture. Yes?
Why is he sitting down and she's standing up?
Why do you think?
That was their roles.
No, I don't know. Britt probably just posed him that way.
Because he's in charge.
Maybe.
That's what it was. And the men sat because they were the head of the house.
It looks like she's holding him down.
Get back down. Get back down. I think we're taking a little liberty here. Anyway, he needed to be set. He needed to have a home. He needed to be able to support a family and a wife, and so he didn't get married until, he was, I think, 30. 28.
I think he was 28.
He's born in 1836. No, he was 30. Yeah, he was 30 when he got married, and she was 19, I think.
17.
What? Oh, okay. Yeah, these guys have been reading their diaries.
Because she just recently turned 18.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
You better be careful.
I love that. I love that. You can be my editor, Ruby. Yeah. Anyway, they like to be able to support a family and do all that stuff. So it took him a long time, because here he is trying to get that farm going, trying to make enough money, trying to establish himself, when all of his neighbors have loads of kids to work with and loads of other enterprises. He wasn't just a farmer. He went in. He became a butcher. He became a surveyor. He was a justice of the peace for a while. He took the He was a census taker. He diversified his occupation as much as he could. But yeah, he wanted to get married in the worst way. Yeah, he did. Yeah.
There's a Beeson Road, isn't there? And is that where the family residence was vicinity of?
Yes, that house is still there. It's close to Shelley's house. Oh, here's a better picture. Oh, they're both the same. This is what the house looks like now. It was an hexagonal house. I'm telling you, these Beesons are very strange people. They are very different. The secret to the hexagonal house was that when John Beeson went back to New York and lived at the Water Cure Institute, guess who else lived there? Orson Fowler, who wrote the book about building octagonal houses. Yeah. So, so he What was that question I was answering? I forgot.
Beeson Lane.
Oh yeah, Beeson Lane comes in right where that house on Wagner Creek Road. Beeson Lane comes right at the junction of that house with the big water tower and stuff in the back. That's the house where the Beeson property was. John lived in the hexagonal house when he came back in 1865, and then again when he came back in the 1880s. And Wellborn and his family lived there until they lost the farm. And that's another story.
Oh, no.
Goes on and on and on. Yeah.
The Wagner Creek School that you mentioned.
Oh, here's a picture of the Wagner Creek School. This was built on the Beeson property. This was the second school on the Beeson property, not the first one. This later got moved over to Culver Lane and became a kind of a boarding house for orchard people. And then Lynn Newbury lived in it, and it burned down. But anyway, that's there's a bunch of Beesons in here too. A bunch of Beeson kids. Yeah.